Good day, and welcome to AI Podcast at digitVIEW. Whether you're a business leader, technologist, or simply curious about what's next, we explore how artificial intelligence is transforming the way we work, create, and make decisions.
Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down big ideas by going straight to the source. And today, we're looking at a brand new American way of war, all laid out in a really revealing interview.
So let's start with this quote right here. It means we're fighting to win. It means we set the terms. This comes from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and honestly, it cuts right to the chase. What you're hearing is a really deliberate shift away from, nuance or drawn-out diplomacy. The new strategy is all about absolute clarity and, American control. So what's the number one goal here? Well, it's pretty unambiguous. We're not talking about negotiations or stalemates. The stated objective, the big one, is unconditional surrender.
Okay, but unconditional surrender can mean a lot of things, right? In this case, the secretary says it's not about some big public ceremony with signing papers. It's a much more practical military definition. It means you make the enemy totally combat ineffective. Basically, they get to a point where they simply cannot fight back anymore, whether they admit it publicly or not.
And here's the really crucial part. This isn't a two-way street. The US alone decides when that goal is met. So the timeline, how you measure success, the very definition of victory, it's all decided by one side. It really drives home that whole "we set the terms" idea.
All right, so let's dig into how this all adds up to a new kind of war. Because this approach is being framed as a total rejection of how America has fought its most recent wars.
You can see the contrast they're drawing pretty clearly here. The secretary flat out calls the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan dumb wars. He says, look, those had these vague, nebulous end states. We got bogged down in nation building for years. This time, it's all about clear objectives, swift, overwhelming action, and it's all based squarely on what's good for America. Nothing else.
And this slide really boils it all down, doesn't it? Lead with clarity, focus on America first objectives, give the military everything it needs, and that last one again, the US sets the terms and decides when it's all over. The whole idea is to strip away all the ambiguity of past conflicts.
Yet this quote, "This is not a fair fight, and that's on purpose." I mean, it doesn't get much more blunt than that. The whole strategy really hinges on this idea. Use America's massive technological and military advantage to get it done quick. The goal is to avoid getting stuck in a long, drawn-out fight.
Okay, so as you can imagine, an approach this bold has its critics. A lot of people have questions, and in the interview, the secretary was asked to address some of the big ones about the legality, the motivation, and the timing of it all.
So first up, a really interesting question came from within the America First movement. Some supporters were asking, hey, is this kind of foreign conflict really America First?
And the secretary's response was essentially, look, I'm in the room where it happens every single day. I see how the president operates. He argues that from his perspective, every single decision is being made with only one thing in mind: what's best for America, Americans, and American interests.
Then you've got the legal question, which is a big one. Congress hasn't formally declared war. So is the US officially at war? What's the legal basis here?
Well, the administration's position is pretty much to brush aside the legal debate. The quote is, "The lawyers will debate all these things. Call it what you want." Their point is, if a fight is necessary, we're going to fight to win, and we're not going to get hung up on the terminology.
So that leads to the next question. Why now? What was the imminent threat? And here, the administration basically calls that whole debate silly and academic. They're framing this not as a response to one specific immediate thing, but as a response to 47 years of Iranian aggression and their nuclear ambitions. It's a long-term problem getting a short-term solution. So if unconditional surrender is the goal, what's the long-term vision? What happens after? Well, the secretary points to a really surprising and, let's be honest, pretty controversial model for what success could look like. When he was asked what a successful outcome looks like down the road, the answer he gave was Venezuela, which is a fascinating choice, right? Because Venezuela itself was very recently the target of intense American pressure. And this is where you start to see the long-term thinking. They're reframing Venezuela as a shining example of this strategy. The idea is that you can use overwhelming power and pressure to turn an adversary into a Well, into a strategic opportunity. You reestablish relations, kick out hostile foreign influence, and create a new kind of partner. And this isn't just a random thought, you know? It's part of a much bigger strategic picture. They've actually given it a name for the Western Hemisphere. They're calling it the Monroe Doctrine. And yeah, that's a very intentional echo of the old Monroe Doctrine. Okay, finally, we have to talk about the price of all this. Because a military operation this big has consequences. And the interview didn't shy away from the human and economic costs.
To really understand this next part, you have to remember one number: 6. That's how many days into the campaign they were when this interview happened. The secretary literally said, "We have just now begun to fight." So everything we're about to discuss about the cost, it's all being said from the very, very beginning of this thing.
So, let's talk about the economic side. They know there's a risk of a global oil shock. They say there's a world-class team managing it, working with allies. But they are crystal clear on one thing: a potential spike in gas prices is not a limiting factor. In other words, pain at the pump for you and me is not going to stop them from achieving their main goal. And of course, beyond the money, there's the price that matters most: the human cost. What about the American troops who are actually fighting this? The secretary was very direct about this. He said there will be casualties, but then he said something pretty remarkable. He said that loss, it doesn't weaken American resolve. He says it stiffens our spine and actually makes the commitment to finish the fight even stronger. And that really leaves us with the big takeaway from all this. In the eyes of the administration, this is not some quick in-and-out operation. They see this as a generational challenge. This is something that's meant to fundamentally redefine American power for the next few decades. Which leaves us all with a pretty heavy question. At what cost?
We must ask ourselves, is this topic up for debate?
Let's dissect it.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are examining a really profound shift in American military doctrine. Specifically, we're looking at the framework laid out in Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's extended interview regarding the ongoing U.S. military operations against Iran.
Right, and that covers the initial 12-day war, Operation Midnight Hammer, and the current ongoing campaign, Operation Epic Fury.
Exactly. And the central question we are exploring today is this: does the newly articulated doctrine of seeking an adversary's unconditional surrender strictly by rendering them combat ineffective from the air, and importantly doing this without engaging in traditional nation building or explicit regime change, does that represent a strategically sound evolution of warfare? Or does it contain inherent contradictions that risk long-term instability?
It's a massive question. And for our listeners, I'll be arguing that demanding unconditional surrender while explicitly avoiding societal reconstruction is conceptually flawed. It's historically unprecedented, really. Relying almost entirely on punitive campaigns from the air ignores the long-term regional complexities left in the wake of those operations. I believe this risks a scenario where the military campaign is, won on paper, but the underlying strategic threat remains completely unresolved.
And I will be taking the position that this approach is actually a highly pragmatic, evidence-based correction to past military failures. By successfully leveraging overwhelming technological superiority, the United States is finally securing its core interests without the endless entanglements that have defined, really the last 2 decades of foreign policy.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Yeah, to kick this off, we really have to look at why the current strategy represents such a masterful application of precision power. Secretary Hegseth pointedly reminds us that it's now called the Department of War. And if we look at the evidence provided in the material, the results are pretty undeniable. During Operation Midnight Hammer, the U.S. completely obliterated Iran's nuclear program. Now, in the opening days of Operation Epic Fury, we have seen a staggering 90% reduction in their missile projection capabilities.
I'll grant you the numbers. A 90% reduction in missile projection is a massive tactical achievement.
It is, and it's what happens when a military objective is strictly defined and ruthlessly executed. What I find most compelling here is the explicit rejection of what the Secretary rightly calls the foolish approaches of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The hubris of trying to build a Jeffersonian democracy in a society operating on entirely different historical and cultural paradigms. That costs trillions of dollars, it costs thousands of lives. Instead, the current doctrine focuses simply on destroying the enemy's ability to project power by sinking their naval assets, by destroying their mobile launchers with 500 to 2,000 pound gravity bombs, The administration has established a clear, measurable, and achievable objective. It's the ultimate realization of an America First strategy. We are neutralizing threats without getting bogged down in remaking a foreign society.
I hear that, but that is exactly where the contradiction lies. The objective of unconditional surrender inherently clashes with the refusal to remake the society you are attacking. You cannot demand total capitulation while simultaneously washing your hands of the day after.
Why not, though? I mean, if the threat is neutralized, why is the day after our responsibility?
Because nature and geopolitics abhors a vacuum. Look at the material. The secretary himself acknowledges the 8-year Iran-Iraq war. That was a brutal, grinding conflict where Iran suffered massive, almost unthinkable losses, and yet they never surrendered. That historical reality deeply questions the psychological assumptions driving Operation Epic Fury. The administration is relying purely on air dominance to degrade an enemy whose regime is fundamentally premised on religious fanaticism. Rendering an enemy combat ineffective, that's a temporary military status.
I wouldn't call it temporary if the capabilities are physically destroyed.
But it's a spreadsheet showing fewer munitions and launchers today. It is not a permanent political resolution.
I think we need to look at how the Secretary is fundamentally redefining unconditional surrender for the 21st century. It is no longer about a formal ceremony in Tehran. It's not about a signed piece of paper or, forcing a regime to publicly admit defeat on television. It is exactly what you just called it, a mathematical military reality. As he stated, whether their pride allows them to say it out loud or not, they will be combat ineffective.
A mathematical reality doesn't govern human behavior in the long term, though.
In military terms, it absolutely dictates what a regime can and cannot do. And I argue that this is a vastly superior modern metric for victory. If the regime cannot shoot short-range ballistic missiles at our bases, if they cannot deploy one-way attack drones, and if their naval capabilities are sitting at the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz, the objective is met. The psychological state of the regime becomes completely irrelevant if their physical capacity to project power is reduced to zero.
Let's pull on that thread, actually, because you accurately quote the secretary comparing the remaining missile launchers to lots of bullets without a gun.
Exactly.
It's a great analogy. It highlights how effective striking mobile launchers is in the short term. But what happens when the bombers fly home?
Well, the bombers don't just fly home and forget about it. The airspace is continuously monitored.
Right, but realistically, how long does that take? Are we talking about bombing factories and monitoring airspace for the next decade? If the regime survives and simply waits, which, by the way, Hegseth explicitly admits they might try to do regarding their nuclear ambitions, then this mathematical unconditional surrender is nothing but an illusion. You're merely pausing the conflict. You're turning the country into a parking lot for broken missile launchers, but the ideological engine driving the conflict is still running.
But if they try to rebuild, the U.S. strikes again. That is the whole point of establishing complete air dominance.
And that brings up a glaring tension in the administration's messaging to the people actually living under that airspace. On one hand, the secretary calls this relentless bombardment a generational opportunity for the Iranian people to rise up. On the other hand, he explicitly states that the U.S. mission scope does not include protecting those people, nor does it include coordinating with Kurdish forces massing on the border. You cannot invite a civilian population to overthrow a theocracy and then tell them they are entirely on their own while 2,000-pound bombs are falling.
I have to completely disagree with the premise that we are inviting them to rise up and then abandoning them. The administration is simply recognizing that true, lasting societal change must be organic. The United States is providing the conditions for change by systematically dismantling the oppressive apparatus of the regime. We aren't leading the revolution. We are removing the regime's ability to crush it with heavy military assets.
Removing heavy military assets doesn't stop a theocratic police force from suppressing a domestic uprising, though.
Perhaps not entirely, but it fundamentally shifts the balance of power on the ground. But I want to return to the efficacy of this strategy because we really have to look at the unprecedented technological and operational integration that makes this containment possible. The material highlights the combined power of the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force. That's the two most powerful air forces in the world operating with absolute impunity.
The technological integration is undeniably staggering. I definitely won't dispute that.
It is, and it's forcing a profound shift upon Iranian forces. The material discusses the scoot and shoot dynamic. For our listeners, this means that because of American loitering munitions, drones that essentially hang out in the airspace waiting for a target to present itself, Iranian forces can no longer take the time to set up and aim. They have to rush out of hiding, fire blindly, and run back before a drone strikes them. As a result, their salvos are dramatically lower in volume and far less accurate. This proves the core thesis of the doctrine. Technological dominance can effectively neutralize a massive regional threat without deploying hundreds of thousands of ground troops.
Look, I will concede that the rapid scale-up of drone dominance is an impressive military feat. But assuming the technology works perfectly in a vacuum is a mistake. Relying entirely on overwhelming munitions dropping, what the Secretary calls unlimited supplies of gravity bombs, inevitably creates messy collateral realities that technology alone cannot cleanly resolve.
We are utilizing highly advanced precision-guided munitions. This isn't carpet bombing.
Even with precision-guided munitions, conducting a high-intensity, strictly kinetic campaign from the air carries immense risks. We see this precisely in the ongoing investigation into the strike on a girls' school mentioned in the material. A purely punitive air campaign creates realities on the ground that fuel the exact anti-American sentiment sustaining the regime in the first place. Furthermore, this approach is severely straining the broader strategic ecosystem.
Straining it how? The U.S. industrial base is surging to meet the moment. They have a $1.5 trillion budget.
I'm talking about our allies. The reporting indicates that allied forces in the region are running dangerously low on interceptors. The Secretary insists the U.S. is prepared to cross-load munitions to allies, but that just highlights the massive logistical burden of containing a threat purely through constant bombardment. It complicates the narrow America First objective by dragging allies into an unending defensive posture. If they run out of interceptors, the math of your combat ineffective argument suddenly changes.
I hear your point on logistics, but that assumes the alternative is somehow cleaner or less burdensome. The tragic realities of collateral damage are constant in any armed conflict. That is exactly why the Secretary emphasized that the U.S. investigates these incidents rigorously, unlike adversaries who intentionally target civilians. And regarding the logistical burden, for 47 years, American policy has been paralyzed by the fear of regional escalation. That hesitation allowed a regime premised on death to America to pursue nuclear ambitions unabated. It allowed them to target American troops with EFPs. And just for clarity, EFPs, or explosively formed penetrators, are those highly lethal, armor-piercing roadside bombs that cause so much devastation to our forces. By prioritizing the elimination of this generational threat over short-term logistical discomfort, the administration is making a difficult but entirely necessary choice.
I just wouldn't call depleting Allied interceptor stockpiles a short-term logistical discomfort. It's a massive strategic vulnerability.
It is a vulnerability that is actively being managed by that $1.5 trillion defense budget we talked about. But let's look at the broader strategic vision here, specifically the paradigm shift illustrated by the Venezuela model cited in the material. This is crucial for understanding the administration's endgame.
Yeah, I was hoping we would get to this comparison, because it is baffling.
It is actually a very sound template. The Secretary argues that relentless American power and pressure can successfully neutralize an adversary and transform them into a strategic opportunity. Look at what happened in Venezuela. Immense pressure led to reestablish relationships, an American embassy presence, the expulsion of Iranian influence, and proper oil processing. All of that was achieved without a traditional ground war. The administration is applying this exact logic to the Middle East. By completely breaking Iran's power projection, the U.S. can dictate terms that secure global energy markets and protect American lives, effectively bringing a rogue state to heel through overwhelming leverage.
I have to push back hard on that. That Venezuela comparison is intellectually strained at best. The Secretary himself had to quickly admit that Venezuela and Iran are very different countries, when challenged on this by senators in a closed-door briefing. Applying a Western Hemisphere economic and diplomatic pressure model to a Middle Eastern conflict is just a false equivalence.
The mechanism of leverage is the same, though, even if the geography and culture are different.
But the mechanism is entirely different. Venezuela was primarily an economic and political crisis in our own hemisphere. The leverage was financial. Iran is a theocracy, driven by religious fanaticism, armed with ballistic missiles, and reeling from the recent obliteration of its nuclear program in Operation Midnight Hammer. You simply cannot expect the leadership in Tehran to respond to pressure the same way Caracas did. A spreadsheet showing zero oil exports in Venezuela hurts their wallet. A spreadsheet showing zero missile launchers in Iran strikes at the core of their ideological resistance.
But the result is the same. They are neutralized as a threat to American interests.
Only if you assume they don't lash out in other ways. And this comparison reveals a dangerous underestimation of global repercussions. When asked about a potential global oil shock resulting from crippling the Strait of Hormuz, the secretary stated that mitigating it is important, but ultimately it is not a limiting factor.
Right, which goes back to what I was saying about prioritization.
But dismissing the potential for a catastrophic global economic shock as merely a secondary concern suggests that the broader consequences of this doctrine are being subordinated to a very narrow military definition of success.
Stating that an oil shock is not a limiting factor isn't a dismissal of the economic consequences. It's a declaration of strategic priorities. The economic mitigation is being handled by a team of energy and treasury experts. But the military mission cannot be held hostage by the global commodities market. The ability to act with boldness, to sink the boats threatening the Strait of Hormuz and permanently degrade that naval capacity is exactly what will ultimately stabilize that region, and by extension, it will stabilize the global markets.
But that stability relies entirely on the assumption that a degraded adversary simply gives up and integrates into a new, peaceful paradigm. You mentioned the trillion-dollar defense budget earlier. The material also talks about the Arsenal of Freedom tour and the push for defense contractors to deliver at speed and scale. The administration is openly setting demand signals for years of critical munitions.
Because overwhelming force requires immense resources.
Yes, but setting demand signals for years of munitions doesn't sound like a doctrine that achieves swift, stabilizing victories. It sounds like a doctrine preparing for perpetual, high-intensity containment. If the strategy requires unlimited gravity bombs, constant drone patrols, and an endlessly churning defense industrial base just to keep a surviving regime combat ineffective, then we haven't actually moved past endless wars, we have simply moved the war from the ground into the sky. The physical risk to American troops may be lower, which is undeniably positive, but the strategic entanglement remains total.
I see the parallel you are drawing, but the difference between perpetual containment and this new doctrine is the objective of total capability destruction. We aren't just containing their missile forces, we are dismantling the manufacturing base that produces them. When you target the launchers, then the missiles, and finally the missile production facilities, you are not signing up for a forever war. You are systematically disarming a hostile state.
But again, are we bombing factories for the next decade?
The secretary was very clear. This is only the beginning. At 6 days into Operation Epic Fury, the U.S. had just begun to operate with impunity over the country. The demand signals to the defense industry are a deterrent posture. It sends a message to the world that the United States possesses both the industrial capacity and the political will to sustain overwhelming force until its objectives are met. It is the exact opposite of the nebulous, open-ended missions of the past. It is a highly specific mission backed by unlimited resources.
You cannot separate the military destruction from the political reality it leaves behind, though. If we look at the materials reference to the U.S. reserving the right to use covert or overt forces on the ground, despite saying no boots on the ground is the current stance, it shows an underlying awareness that air power alone might not be enough to finalize this conflict. You can dismantle a missile production facility from the air, but you cannot dictate the political future of a nation of over 80 million people purely with Predator drones and 2,000-pound bombs. By treating the conflict as a strictly mathematical exercise in lethality, the administration really risks winning the war on paper while failing to secure a lasting, stable peace in reality.
Well, as we draw this discussion to a close, I think it's crucial to reflect on the sheer complexity of the material we've examined today.
From my perspective, discarding the nebulous nation building of the past in favor of overwhelming targeted lethality offers the most rational path to protecting core American interests. By redefining victory as making the enemy combatant ineffective, the U.S. military is operating with a clarity of purpose we really haven't seen in decades. It leverages our greatest strengths, our technological supremacy, and our industrial base, without sacrificing American lives to fundamentally change a foreign society.
And I maintain that while the technological execution is undeniably formidable, seeking maximalist outcomes like unconditional surrender through strictly limited, purely kinetic means risks a dangerous strategic imbalance. Winning the military campaign by turning a country into a parking lot for broken missile launchers does not erase the underlying ideological threat, nor does it absolve us of the chaotic vacuum it creates in the region.
Despite our differing perspectives, there is a clear point of convergence here. We both agree that the source material outlines a historic and highly deliberate paradigm shift in U.S. military doctrine. This administration has explicitly moved away from the strategies of previous decades, relying heavily on the assumption that drone dominance, precision air power, and an unyielding application of force can fundamentally redefine the nature of victory in modern warfare.
Absolutely. The material presents a profound reimagining of how the United States projects power, for better or worse.
We encourage all of our listeners to consider how these varying frameworks of conflict resolution and power projection will reshape the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century. The material offers profound questions about the future of warfare, and as always, we leave the ultimate judgment of this doctrine's long-term viability entirely up to you.
Thank you for joining us for the AI podcast at DigitView. We look forward to having you with us again soon.
This is DigitView.